Good morning. It is Monday, the 23rd of March. I'm Maeve McMahon and you're watching Europe Today. Your daily look at the stories shaping Europe and beyond, live here on Euronews. Coming up, all eyes on the Middle East. Iran is warning of a strong response if US President Donald Trump follows through on threats to target Iranian power infrastructure within 48 hours. As the conflict enters its 24th day, tensions are rising with no clear breakthrough in sight, and growing concerns over global energy supplies as disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz continue to impact shipping. According to the Iranian Red Crescent, meanwhile, thousands of Iranians have been injured since the fighting began, with more than 1,000 civilians reported dead. In Lebanon, the toll is also mounting, with over 1 million people displaced. Meanwhile, in southern Israel, communities are recovering after recent strikes seriously injured locals. For the latest developments and to find out what to watch next, we're joined here on set by Yuroniews's Stefan Kobe. Morning, Stefan.
Good morning, Maeve.
So look, President Trump has taken to Truth Social to say if Iran does not fully open the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours, the US will hit and obliterate their various power plants. Fill us in.
Well, that ultimatum you just mentioned will expire tonight, and we're all trying to figure out what happens next. The president will travel to Memphis, Tennessee today for a domestic event, and hopefully he'll let us know either on Air Force One or on the ground what happens next. Now, together with strikes, potential strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure, the ongoing surge of U.S. troops to the Middle East could set the stage for a Battle of Hormuz, which would be, for the control of the Strait of Hormuz, could be a new phase of the war. Now, there are roughly 4,500 U.S. sailors and Marines on their way to the Middle East as we speak, including an infantry battalion landing team. Now, those forces are not coming to the area for decoration. They could be part of a new phase of the war, for instance, the invasion of critical Iranian oil infrastructure, the island of Kark, for instance, or other installations. And such an invasion would be an off-ramp for Trump. He could declare victory. He could bring relief to the battled oil markets, and he could keep the Iranians in check. So whether this will happen, of course, we have to wait.
And that's the thing. It's hard to keep up with President Trump. His messaging keeps changing on this war. So what does that say, Stefan, about the kind of strategy here of the US?
Well, strategy is a big word. It's pretty incoherent. So the day before he announced his ultimatum, which would be an escalation of the war, he said, well, we have basically reached our objectives and we're winding down. That does not really go hand in hand. And on Sunday, Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent said, he tried to justify Trump's contradictory remarks, saying that they're not mutually exclusive and you have to escalate in order to de-escalate. So the situation has to get worse before it can get better. He also offered an interesting timeline. He said the war could go on for another 30 days or 50 days or 100 days. Now, Maeve, you picked your number. We're as smart as we were 3 weeks ago on this.
Well, whatever happens, we will report it. And of course, meanwhile, the humanitarian toll keeps increasing, as we reported earlier. Stefan Kobe, thank you so much for that update there. Now, moving on, Hungary is hosting their annual CPAC conference in Budapest just 3 weeks before the most important elections of Prime Minister Viktor Orban's political career. In power for 16 years, the populist anti-EU leader is welcoming far-right allies today from Germany, Austria and Spain, among others. The CPAC gathering comes as Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk reveals that Viktor Orban could be leaking EU summit secrets to Russia's Vladimir Putin. For more, I'm joined here now on set by our Maria Tadeo. Good morning, Maria.
Good morning.
So we know also that President Trump has endorsed officially Viktor Orban ahead of this campaign, but he's not showing up at this CPAC.
No, he is not. And also we should know the CPAC, of course, is a big conservative conference that has become aligned with the MAGA right and the MAGA world to some extent. And that includes, of course, the president of the U.S. But this is the international branch of it. It was held yesterday and opened yesterday in Budapest. Viktor Orban was the keynote speaker. And this was a conference beyond the traditional talking points, which, of course, center around the idea of no woke, no migration, yes to a Christian-led family family-oriented society. It was really an event for the glory of Viktor Orban ahead of that election. And to that point, the president of the U.S. was not physically present, but he did send a message in which he said his endorsement of Viktor Orban is full, total, and complete. Let's take a look.
I also want to send my best wishes to Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who I am endorsing, as you know. I am endorsing his election, which is coming up pretty soon. He has my complete and total endorsement, as a matter of fact. The Prime Minister has been a strong leader who's shown the entire world what's possible when you defend your borders, your culture, your heritage, your sovereignty, and your values. Our two countries are showing the way toward a revitalized West. We're going to be working hard together on energy, and you're going to be working and continuing to work very hard on immigration, because Europe has got to sort of get going a little bit.
Well, Europe has to get going a little bit. You saw that in that message, the president of the U.S., really the full power of the Trump administration behind Viktor Orban. We're also expecting, not a date confirmed yet, but expecting a trip by the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, who has cited Viktor Orban as an inspiration when it comes to politics. You also had Marco Rubio, remember, on a tour in Central Europe just a few weeks ago. All of this power behind the re-election of Viktor Orban, who is trailing in polls. But of course, when you look at any election, as soon as you get close to voting day, and that is April 12th for the Hungarians, that poll usually narrows the distance between the two candidates. So you could see a tight race between Viktor Orban and Péter Magyar. For any European diplomat in Brussels, the capitals, all of them will tell you this is the most consequential election for Europe this year, because the clash between Budapest and Brussels is now total. And yesterday, Viktor Orban got a very friendly audience, but just 3 days ago, let's remember, at the European summit, he was trashed by everyone, including the head of the European Council.
Well, just on that point, we're also seeing a spat between the Poles and the Hungarians ahead of this election.
Yes, over the weekend, all of this starts because of a report in the Washington Post, which said two things. Both accounts are explosive. One is that Russian intelligence worried last month that Viktor Orban is not polling strongly. And one of the ideas they floated to energize the campaign was to stage an assassination attempt. That is count number one. And then count number two, this report suggested that the Hungarian foreign minister regularly spoke, including during meetings with his Russian counterpart, Lavrov, to debrief him on the content of EU summits. Of course, EU summits, these are held in private. The content is understood to be confidential among the 27. And the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk responded over the weekend in a tweet saying that he is not surprised about these allegations in the newspaper, as I mentioned, the Washington Post, but also said the news that Orban's people inform Moscow about EU Council meetings and every detail should not come as a surprise. We've long had our suspicions that this was happening, and there's one reason, or that's the one reason why I take the floor only when strictly necessary and say just as much as necessary. Obviously, the two accounts are explosive. The Hungarians deny it, but nonetheless, that is the mood between the EU 27, and this is inevitably going to bring up a question in terms of should the Hungarians be kept out of delicate discussions? Should there be closer cooperation among some EU countries, but leave the Hungarians out? And then, of course, there's a question of Antonio Costa. Can he really bring about his authority when it comes to Viktor Orban, who, again, was trashed at this EU summit, but nonetheless, his double veto on Ukraine remains.
Okay, countdown is on to those very important elections. Maria Stale, thank you so much for that update. Now, coming up, we'll be joined by Bart-Jan Vector, the EU counter-terrorism coordinator. The Dutch diplomat is at the forefront of Europe's fight against terrorism and is in the spotlight today, given yesterday marks 10 years since the deadly Brussels bombings that took the lives of 32 people. 16 who were on board a metro just a stone's throw from the Yuronius studio here in the EU quarter, and 16 who were inside the Brussels airport departure area just checking in for their flights. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us here on Europe Today. So look, 10 years on now from those horrific Brussels attacks. For victims and their families watching this morning, what changes do you feel have been made here that makes Europe safer than it was back in 2016?
Well, first of all, like you say, today is really that we think about all the victims like we did yesterday. There were national commemorations in Belgium. Why? Because this affected so many people. I think we all know people in some way have been affected by these attacks that reverberated really throughout Europe. Now, what I'd say to victims today is that we're in a much better place. We haven't seen this type of large-scale concerted attacks in Europe for the last 10 years or so. And that's very much thanks to, I would say, in the first place, the activities of our law enforcement intelligence agencies throughout Europe.
So that's obviously very reassuring as well for our viewers who are tuning in this morning. So what are the chances of dying today in a terrorist attack in Europe?
Well, if you consider the number of attacks that we've seen a different kind of attacks. We've seen the more self-initiated attacks by lone actors, if you will. So IS, that was responsible for the terrorist attacks in Brussels 10 years ago, has really adjusted its strategies, which means that we've also had to adjust. So I would say that the chances are low, but what we see is that we're trying to grasp a new phenomenon, which is new, which is young people radicalizing very fast, radicalizing online, and that's something we have to grapple with today.
And as someone who covered those terrorist attacks, I remember back 10 years ago, there was no trust between member states. There was very bad coordination as well between authorities. Has that improved today?
Very much so, very much so. We've, in Europe, and I should say very much pushed also by the Belgians and the French, who of course were the first affected by these major terrorist attacks. Their services have very much put together, for instance, a task force together called Task Force Fraternité, to work together on these investigations, but also to push very much for efforts at European level, meaning that we've put in place interoperable databases. We've strengthened our borders. We exchange information much more fast at different levels, at national level, but also at European level. And mostly, what's very important is that at European level, was also beyond strengthening our borders, we've invested much more in relations and dialogues with third countries, because we know that the terrorist threat emanates also from beyond our borders very much.
And we're reporting, of course, on the 24th day of the ongoing war in Iran. We've seen that Europol has warned there could be immediate repercussions for us here in Europe, be that violent extremism or cyber attacks. What are you seeing?
Look, any situation of conflict and violence, instability in any region, always gives an opportunity to terrorists to assert themselves. And what we're seeing is, of course, that it creates a lot of narratives, a lot of propaganda online that, again, the young people that I mentioned before and many others will be affected by, can be influenced by. That being said, Iran has for a long time already been known as being what I would call a lethal spoiler, using terrorist tactics on our soil, instrumentalizing criminal networks, to carry out attacks, to basically disrupt our society, to target dissidents, cyber attacks. We've seen a range of, let's say, instruments used by the Iranians. So it's been on our radar for a long time. Of course, in the current context, you could argue that that threat will only increase.
OK, Bashid Victor, thank you so much for coming into us here on Europe Today on Euronews. But now, moving on, European car owners might have to pay up to €150 extra per day as oil prices surpass $100 a barrel. That's according to a new study by Transport and Environment, who argue that unless Europe weans off fossil fuels, it will always be vulnerable to geopolitical shocks. Our Yakubianis takes a look at how EU governments are grappling with this huge consequence of Trump's war on Iran.
Next time you grumble at the petrol pump, who should you really be mad at? The oil companies, your government, or maybe the EU? The truth is, you're paying for a lot more than just the energy itself. In 20 EU countries, taxes swallow more than half the price of petrol. And the EU sets a minimal petrol tax, but national governments pile on the rest. So when the Iran war spikes oil prices, these heavy levies multiply the pain of your wallet. So are there any governments stepping in to ease the pressure? The answer is yes, and Spain is leading the charge. Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez just took drastic action, rolling out €5 billion emergency package featuring 80 different measures. The standard 21% VAT on fuel, electricity and natural gas will go down to just 10%. And for drivers, that cut is expected to knock about 30 cents of a litre of petrol. The retail price of butane and propane, so the gas used to power your stove and heat your home, will be completely frozen. Finally, the government is also temporarily suspending the tax on the value of electricity production and issuing direct fuel subsidies for farmers and fishermen. And some countries are following suit. Italy and Austria are already planning their own national tax cuts to shield citizens. Moreover, during the last week's summit, EU leaders ordered the Commission to draft temporary emergency measures, which is basically political speak for we need to find quick fix to stop the bleeding. But the overall conclusion seems to be clear. The only permanent escape from volatile fuel prices is a faster shift to domestic renewables. So let's look again at Spain, because almost 60% of their power already comes from renewables. they end up being naturally shielded from these gas price spikes. And I just wish we had this kind of a sunlight here in Brussels.
Now, moving on, all eyes on Slovenia this morning. The EU member state since 2004, with a population of just over 2 million, held elections this weekend. And it looks like a tie between the Liberal Party of Robert Golob and the former right-wing populist leader, Janez Janša. For more on the dramatic election, which was overshadowed by election interference and claims of espionage, we're joined here on set by Petros Fasoulas from the European Movement International. Good morning. So it was a tight race, Petros, but we saw the Liberals claiming victory.
Indeed, this was as close as it can get. And in fact, the election itself, but also the campaign that preceded it, was worthy of a Netflix political drama. We've seen accusations of foreign interference, corruption. We have seen a very heated debate between two opposing politicians representing completely different views of the world. And as a result, I think the Slovenian voters were found guessing and delivered a very close result.
And now that it is so tight, it might be very hard to form a government.
Indeed. Now a lot depends on who is able to master the coalition and bring together smaller parties. So it's by no means a done deal. Of course, a lot of people in Brussels were worried that former Prime Minister Janša will return in power. We know his close links to Trump. We know he has been very critical of the direction the EU is taking. And as a result, he is expected to join perhaps Orban in the awkward club. So people will be watching very closely what the result of these negotiations will be.
And as you said, the election campaign itself was very tricky.
Indeed. And we saw once again that even a small election can master international interest. And of course, at the moment where we are, with external interference increasing in our politics, where democracy is under threat even internally, even a population of 2 million can make a huge difference. And that's why forces within and outside of the EU are trying to influence that result.
OK, Petros Fasoulas from the European Movement International, thank you so much for your analysis there. And meanwhile, a second round of local elections took place in France yesterday, which saw the socialists hold on to power in the big cities like Paris, Marseille, Lyon and Lille. For more on the outcome there, our France correspondent Sofia Katzinkova sent us this update.
France's municipal elections have delivered one clear message tonight, and it's that the left is holding on to the major cities in France, including the capital Paris, where I'm currently standing. And behind me, left-wing supporters have just finished celebrating the victory of socialist mayor Emmanuel Grégoire. In the second largest city of France, Marseille, well, socialist Benoît Payon was also re-elected. But the left remains divided. The hard left of France Unbowed Party also made quite some significant gains this Sunday, even though they were excluded from alliances, especially by the socialists during the campaign, who accused France Unbowed of anti-Semitism. The far right failed to win some of the major cities that it was targeting, including Marseille and the southern city of Toulon. But in Nice, Éric Ciotti, an ally of the far right national rally, ended up winning. President Emmanuel Macron's Renaissance Party also made some major gains, including the southwestern city of Bordeaux. But this Sunday is more than just about local politics. It is also an early sign of how the battle of France's 2027 presidential election is beginning to take shape.
Sofia Katzinkova there reporting for us on those elections. There was also, of course, local elections in Germany this weekend. For more on any of those elections or any of the stories that we're covering for you, you can, of course, visit Euronews.com, download our app or visit any of our social media sites. But that does bring this edition of Europe Today to an end. Thank you so much for your company and for tuning in. As always, you can always reach out and write to us as well whenever you feel like it. It's Europe Today at Euronews.com. Take care and see you soon on Euronews.